Good morning, everybody. It's really just a privilege to be here and to be part of this conference. Such an important 2 days, really, and I think we're all cheering in the background for Mary to get what she wants to set up, because I think it's so important. It's a tough call to follow on after Monica, I have to say. Much of Monica's work, the early work and her work on domestic violence and the conflict here, influenced the work that I did and that I'm going to talk about now. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the research that I did, and I'll just give you a little bit of an overview first. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the context of the research itself, what we know what happened related to the conflict here, some of the critical elements that I suppose add a different, specific flavour to the conflict-related violence in this context, and then some of what the response has been. And I don't mean response in the practical terms, but just in terms of us coming to grips, really, with having a conversation about what's happened here in relation to women in the conflict. One of the things that I suppose the steer I got, if I'm allowed to say that, from Mary is really to present some of this work as an injection into the conversation today to talk about what we don't really talk about, right? To acknowledge some of the backdrop of the legacy of what has happened in this context. And I think it's really, really important to do that. Some of what Monica has just presented will provide some context for what I'm going to talk about, and as you'll see, there's a lot of overlap of our work as well, but we're both aware of that, and some of it is really just to kind of reinforce some of that message as well. And as I present my work, I'm just keenly aware that there are people in the room here who, first of all, know a lot more about this than I do, that have experience of these issues in ways that I don't, and that, here I am from down the road, the south, and I'm coming in to talk to you about your communities. And just to say that I'm very aware of that, but the work I'm presenting here is a snapshot of a bigger project that I have, so it's not exhaustive, it's not covering everything. I understand the nuances of some of what I'm going to present and the political sensitivities around it. I just don't have time to kind of go into a bigger debate on that, just to kind of acknowledge that as we go on. So let me just talk about, just give you some context to the research I did. I did a 4-year study here in Northern Ireland between 2008 and 2011, and it was largely qualitative based. And as Monica said, I couldn't do the kind of work that she's done, which is sit down with women themselves and talk to them. But I talked to people who work in the shelters, who work with women who've experienced this violence. And I'm very grateful there's many people in the room here today who I did talk to. And I also spend a lot of time, and I'm digging, and I mean digging, in archives, in libraries here in Northern Ireland. I was up to my eyeballs in dust and boxes and pulling out pamphlets and getting little snippets of an example of a violation and kind of pulling that all together. And so what I have is this kind of eclectic collection of individual incidents and stories of what women happen to have said at different times about what they experienced. And so there's a caution there around that, and that I don't want to overstate the claims I'm trying to make, but at the same time, even if it happens one time, we need to acknowledge that, right? It's important to acknowledge those things that women experienced. So my work comes from a mix of primary interviews with service providers and from secondary archival material from the work of women's organisations here in Northern Ireland that I've kind of collated together and compiled it, and you'll see what I have now. I'm keenly aware that in this context, and I've worked, similar to what Monica said, I've worked globally in many armed conflicts. I've worked with the United Nations and some aid agencies delivering services to sexual violence survivors in places like Darfur, Sudan, Burundi, other places. And in Northern Ireland, we have a dearth of information, really, of what's happened to women here. We have sources of information that are coming from some communities and not from other communities. There's all sorts of propaganda and political sensitivities around data, and again, I'm keenly aware of that, and I do, make sure and kind of note that in the work that I've published. I'm going to talk about just some of the terminology, conflict-related violence against women, and I'll explain what I mean by that now. State actors, which are military and police, and non-state actors, which largely are paramilitaries. So, just a little bit then to the conflict itself. When I started out doing this study, it was in the context of doing a PhD at Ulster University at the Transitional Justice Institute. And I had come in from working in places where conflict-related violence against women takes place on a mass and public scale. We would say rape as a weapon of war, for example. And I was planning to study two contexts where that kind of violence is taking place. And it was actually one of my supervisors who suggested to me that I include Northern Ireland as a case study. And I kind of just hadn't occurred to me because it's not somewhere where you think of, right? When you think of violence against women in conflict, places in the world that spring to mind are Sudan, the Congo, Western African states, Eastern Europe, right, the former Yugoslavia. And so it was really curious. I thought, yeah, let me have a look at that. And it really was a very valuable lesson for me, certainly as someone who's worked on these issues and as a researcher. And part of the findings of my research really is for us to understand that violence against women in conflict doesn't have to look like that. It doesn't have to reach a certain threshold, like mass out, cross-community sexual violence, for it to matter or to be called conflict-related violence. There's violence that occurs against women that is directly related to the conflict and is part of armed tactics. But there's also violence that's not a political strategy, but that may just happen as a consequence of the actions of state and non-state actors, but also because of personal motivations. So men who take advantage of the exigencies of a conflict and say, well, here's my opportunity now, I can get away with this because of my status, because of impunity, because I can right now. And women in many, many countries around the world have shown me that and talked to me about that. And so what I'd say as I present this to you is that we need to keep an open mind to the idea that violence has multiple purposes. And there is multi-purpose violence that takes place in conflicts. It may be enacted for specific aims by armed groups. It may also just be an individual saying, well, I have a gun now, I can do what I want. And we need to kind of keep an open mind on that. And the sites and sources of violence in a conflict are variant also. Different actors, different times, different spaces, and it will undulate and change as the context and the violence of a conflict moves around in different places. And when we start to understand violence in any context, we do take the context as a starting point. And one of the most important things for here, and I think for anywhere else, when we understand violence that takes place in a conflict, and particularly gendered violence against women, is that, a conflict doesn't appear out of nowhere, right? It builds up, and that violence is building up and appears. But it also doesn't happen on top of a blank slate. A conflict erupts or takes place in a society that already exists. And that's our societies, which are gendered societies, right? Our societies are filled with norms of how we behave as men and women, gender inequalities, gender discriminations, impacting men and women. And so it's really important that when we understand and come to try and think about violence happening in a conflict, we understand that before the conflict erupted, there was domestic violence already taking place. There was already sexual abuse and different kinds of violences happening to women and children in various ways. And so when we think about what happened during a conflict, we know that's the setting of it. And then you introduced armed actors and the exigencies of sensitive politics, and you think, well, what does that add then to the ways that women already experience violence in this context, and how we understand and how we tolerate it already in our conflicts. And violence after the conflict, as Monica talked about, is influenced by that as well. So I'm going to talk now a little bit about what we know. And as I said, I'm literally going to give you like a watch list of examples. And as I said, they're isolated incidents in many ways. I'm not talking about mass patterns of violence, but they're examples of what people told me and what I found in secondary research that already existed here in the context. I've set it up by state and non-state actors. I haven't got everything in here because I don't have time to cover everything, but just kind of an example of that so that we can get a bit of a flavour for what this is about. And, I just add to my presentation that what I'm presenting is really what's happened already, right? I'm kind of looking backwards a little bit at the conflict. And the purpose of that is just to remember that is part of our society here, that is still here, and to not forget, I suppose, that that's part of our understanding of violence in the context here. So I'm going to talk first about state actors. And I just have two here. Again, there's more, but I just have two kind of categories. So violence by state actors in the home and in security apparatus that were here in Northern Ireland. One of the, it's a piece of research here I'm citing from Derby in 1983 about house searches. Many of you, again, I acknowledge that these happened in Republican communities to a larger degree, but there were house searches across Northern Ireland, and this is the degree to them. So up to 1/5 of all houses in the 1970s were subject to house searches, according to this piece of research. So if that's the degree of house searches, then you have contact happening between state actors, military armed actors, and civilians, if you like, in these contexts. And so that's the opportunity, right? What does that mean for a context of violence? We know from stories that women have told us that in the context of those house searches, women have experienced sexual harassment and threats, physical harassment, threats of assault, derogatory comments. Children have been separated from mothers during the searches, which was very stressful and traumatic for mother and child alike. And, I have a cite there from a piece of research from 1984 that shows a woman who was actually searched by another woman, but she experienced that as unconsented and as a violation of her. We also have women, again, disparate accounts of this, where we had checkpoints and different security apparatus here in Northern Ireland during the conflict, where women felt that every time they passed through them, they were getting derogatory sexual harassment comments from soldiers, that soldiers were, those remarks that you think, did he really say that? Does that mean anything? Am I imagining it? Those kind of comments that are there, that are part of your everyday, but that do add up to that feeling of control and threat as you go about your day. So then moving on to non-state actors, again, I'm just kind of giving you a collation of some of the examples of what we have. One of the things that I mentioned earlier, is that in a typical armed conflict, when we talk about sexual violence, we think about, okay, this group going against this group. So cross-ethnic, if you like, sexual violence. That's not something that's been documented here in Northern Ireland to a large degree at all. And just to state that, I'm not claiming that. But there are one or two isolated incidents which some women have cited and which have been found by different pieces of research, where there was some attacks on women across groups. And, again, isolated incidents, but important to acknowledge. And then in the home, in the context of domestic abuse, which Monica has talked about to some degree, that we have documentation from Monica's own research and some of the research I've done, that there was, as she said, use of firearms to threaten and control women. There's examples where members of paramilitaries would come home and use the night of violence that they had enacted outside the home as a means then to threaten her and carry out violence in the home itself. And that adds an element to the experience of the abuse in the home, that status and control, as Monica mentioned. We also have increasingly, as I'm sure some of you are aware, adults coming forward now and talking about sexual abuse as they were children in their home by members of paramilitaries, and that this being something that the society really is starting to grapple at, and that there's now space for people to come forward. There was also the phenomenon of tarring and feathering, and some of the control of women from detention. So members of paramilitary groups who were in detention using their status and their membership to control women in terms of their social freedoms, their ability to make choices, if you like, about their lives. And so all of this being a way of controlling women. So the tarring and feathering, the punishments that women would get for derogating and going outside of the confines of what they were perceived to be allowed to do, according to the men in their lives, if you like. And a lot of control around women's sexuality and freedoms and who they were and were not allowed to have relationships with, their loyalties to the cause, if you like, and their way that women would behave, and to be reprimanded if they stepped outside the bounds of what was allowed. So after and since the agreement, if you like, we see this in post-conflict contexts around the world, that in the immediate aftermath, there is some kind of recalibration, if you like, of the society. So like, okay, the conflict's over. Where are we at now as a society? Who are we? And then there's the longer term piece of understanding this. As Monica noted, there's a rhetoric globally, if you like, in the global policy space for sure, that violence against women increases after conflict. Another part of this study I did shows that, well, maybe it's not the violence, it's actually the reporting. There's space now for women to come forward. There's more services. There's an ability and there's a framework for me to come forward and say, this happened to me. So actually there's a lot of reporting, and that's something that's really important in the longer term, because a lot of my work in other contexts have shown, and so for example, I worked for 4 years in East Timor in Southeast Asia. And what we found there was that immediately after the conflict ended and the Indonesian regime at the time left, so it's a very different conflict than the one here, but the aggressors left. So the society then is recalibrating itself and saying, okay, it's over, now we need to get our lives together. The immediate concerns of women are not, that's what I experienced. The immediate concerns are, I want to make sure I have a home, my kids can go to school, I can feed my kids. All of the practical concerns with pulling their lives back together. Here it might be making sure you're accessing all the social services and welfare that you need, etc., that you need. But 10 years later, what I heard from Timorese women, I'm ready now. I'm ready for what? I'm ready to talk about the rape. I'm ready now. I want that addressed. I want accountability. I want all of that addressed. But in East Timor, they did all the truth-telling commission in the 2 to 5 years right after the end of the conflict, and it was too late. There was no space then for women when they were ready. So it's really important that after a conflict, we undertake a process that allows people to talk about when they're ready and in the way that they're ready. And as Monica mentioned, and yesterday in our workshop, someone said it again, that there's still this element of paramilitary using paramilitary status as a means to threaten violence and to enact violence, alleged or otherwise, in terms of membership. And that's still an ingredient here to be acknowledged, I suppose, in the violence in this context. So just some of those critical elements that to understand. Contact between state actors and civilians was an element that allowed opportunity for violence. And even where you have sanctions and you have, you're not allowed to do this, you have international law that regulates the behaviour of state actors, there are just some individuals who may enact abuses and harassment, etc., in the context of those. The status and power that someone gets from being part of a membership of a gang or a paramilitary organisation or something like that, all of these, I just had countless interviews with people saying women were afraid to report because of that element. That just adds something to it. Women were threatened to say, I'll say you were involved. The fact that he had these connections, alleged or otherwise, that these added an element to how we understand the experience of violence in that context. And something that I've called implicit impunity. We know the concept of impunity, right? So the law is there to provide accountability to these kinds of behaviours. Impunity happens when the law doesn't function right and you get gratis from that. But there's an implicit impunity that comes with the status of having this level of power and control, which Monica referred to. And as I note in this quote here, it's difficult for anyone to report an experience of abuse in the home. But when he has this broader context to his status, it's even more difficult to come forward. And there's some kind of implicit impunity that was there during the conflict. And, we need to think about whether that's something that's still prevalent now. And I think it's important to acknowledge the nature of the conflict. And, I meant to say this at the start and I forgot, but I was going to use the term conflict. One of the things I've learned from living here previously was, we call the Troubles period different things, right? And I acknowledge that. And I come from the outside, having worked in conflicts or wars, and then I start calling it this. And I have called it this in my work, and I hear people calling it that. But I know that people call it different things. But there's something about the way that the political contestation happened here. In other armed conflicts globally, we have, again, groups of armed soldiers who go elsewhere and fight. We have marauding groups of armed men moving around different communities and getting the other side and the enemy. But here, it was the fact that the paramilitary organisations were embedded in their own communities, that the violence and abuse actually happened within their own communities to a much larger degree than across community, in terms of the intimate violences that happened. And, there's work around how we understand harm. So feminists and feminist scholars would talk about, okay, we have laws and we have policies that say, here's the definition of domestic abuse. Here's how the policy and the law says. But feminists also argue, and I put my own work in this category, that that's great and we need those for sure for policy and law to work. But we also need to have a space where women can say, okay, my violence, my experience doesn't look like that definition, but it's still a harm. It's still something that happened to me and it doesn't feel right. And I need a space to be able to name this and call it something that's not quite fits that definition. Because otherwise it's just a normal thing that happens to me. And something that's normal is presumed not to be harmful. So we need to try and think about how could we find a way to name these things, to allow women to nominate, this is my harm, and I want it acknowledged, and whatever comes part of that. And part of this is something I encountered in my research here, is so many people said to me that, but what you're talking about, what you're asking me about, that was just normal. That was just part of the conflict. This was just part of how we understood what was going on. And of course, that is how people understood what was going on. But if you take it out and say, well, this additional element of him being part of a paramilitary organisation, having the status, having access to guns, all of these critical elements add up to another aspect, if you like, to that violence. And so kind of some key variables for us to understand the conflict-related violence against women in Northern Ireland, directly and indirectly related to conflict for multiple purposes, are the access to resources does matter in terms of status, guns, goods, etc. The opportunity that the chaos of a conflict or the breakdown of the rule of law or, accessing alternative structures of governance, policing, etc., what that creates in terms of committing violence and the inability of women to access state sources, if you like. And then the implicit impunity that can add another ingredient to that. So all of those variables add to the critical elements to how violence took place here and how we understand it and how it was responded to. So then to sum all of that up, kind of a way for us to think about it, this work kind of sits into a broader study that I've done on how do we understand violence that's connected to conflict. Does it matter if we call it conflict-related? Sure, it's violence, regardless of whether it's related to the conflict or not. And it does matter in some circumstances for some people. It may not for others, right? And again, we need space for women to talk about that the way that they wish to talk about it. But certainly, if we look at these examples, we talk about private violence in the home, right? And then we talk about political violence being armed actors for political ends in a conflict. But the violence and examples I just shared with you, they're not very far from being private harms, and they're not very far from being public harms either. They're somewhere in between. And there's a flavour of both in there. And how can we talk about the violence in this context that acknowledges the connection they have to the normal violence, and I say normal violence that women experience in the home, right? The violence that we tolerate for women in our societies. And the distinctive violence that has a distinctive element because it happened by actors in the conflict. And I've met women in many different contexts and here as well who would say, well, that was just my normal violence, that's just part of what we do. And we talk about continuums of violence, right, from conflict to non-conflict, from the home to the street, etc. And that is just a continuum of violence. But for some women, they want to say, but this was a bit different because it was by a soldier, a paramilitary member, etc. And so we need to think about the connections of this violence to the everyday violence, but also in some cases the distinctiveness of it, because that matters then for how we understand the narrative of a conflict, how we understand what happened, and then how we acknowledge it after a conflict. As Monica found in her research, and people told me in mine, that after the agreement there was loads of space then suddenly to talk about domestic violence. So we did start talking about it. The media and the news wanted to fill in. They had nothing to talk about because the paramilitaries weren't active. And so there was a saturation around it. And that's great in one sense, but there was very little attention to what happened then to women related to the conflict, as I've just described. And there was this phenomenon, and now I'm drawing on research here from other women's organisations and other women academics here in Northern Ireland who would talk about how, during the conflict, women who were sitting here in this room, who were doing so much community work at community level, across community and within their own communities, at a voluntary basis. And then, when prisoners were released, they were given paid roles and given those, that kind of formal status, if you like, which diminished the work that women were doing and kind of disappeared it. And there's something around that, how the men's role gets more prominence than what happened to women in the conflict. And this is where it matters around what we call it, whether we say it's conflict-related or not, and whether we want to say, and that's up to the people in this society to decide that. Because after a period of political contestation or a conflict, after an agreement, we have, as Monica referred to, legacy processes that help us say, well, this is what happened and we acknowledge this and we want to transform and move on and transition in our societies now. There's been very few of those in Northern Ireland, and what there has been, largely, I'm drawing from work here from my colleague Catherine O'Rourke, which have clearly missed the element of women's experiences of the conflict. So we had, for example, the Eames-Bradley process, which captured a lot, and I know was difficult for many people here in this context. But there really was no appearance of women specifically in the report of that process. There wasn't an acknowledgement that conflict itself is gendered, our societies are gendered, we don't operate in a vacuum, and that when we talk about our societies being gender neutral, actually it's a secretly coded gendered masculine society, right? Because men get to represent men, they get to represent people, and women just get to represent women. So if men are representing everybody, then we need to make sure that women actually appear specifically, otherwise they disappear. And so the harms that women experience that I've just outlined, some of them, they're not appearing in any of these narratives that are coming forward. And part of it is that, the narrative of the conflict here disappears, if you like, some of the conflict-related violence against women, even though it was at the same time everywhere in the insidious way that it appeared, that it took place. And so we're back to kind of figuring out what do we want to do? Do we want to acknowledge that some of this violence is directly or indirectly related to the conflict? Is there a need to acknowledge some of this? How do we do that as a society? There's parts of this that in the current context is understanding what's happening now, as Mary has talked about, and Monica, in terms of the alleging paramilitary status, for example, in domestic violence abuse, etc. And providing a space for people to talk about it, because there's lots and lots, Northern Ireland is probably one of the most over-researched conflict contexts in the world, right? I know many people are sick to death of doing interviews and doing research and everything. I know, I've been on both ends of it. But at the same time, there seems to be this gap still about women's harms. Mary just referred to a piece of research that was done recently about the violence here, and not a mention of gendered harms, not a mention of women specifically. And again, I think it's back to us creating a space for people to talk, a space for women to name what happened to them in their own way. It doesn't have to be called conflict-related. It doesn't have to be called anything that we already have defined. It's just a space to say, well, this is part of my experience of this period. And it's important if we end up doing any post-conflict, transition mechanisms, if you like, and any legacies of the past. But the processes have got to work for women and girls. They've got to work for the ways that women want to talk about their lives and the experiences of violence in their society. So I leave it there. Thank you.